Well, welcome everyone. My name is Frank Fear for FutureU, and I welcome you on behalf of my colleague, Ruben Martinez, to an important conversation about a significant subject facing not only higher education, but also society at large. I'm talking about the political influence of philanthropy that is happening across the country at American universities and what impact it's having, not only on higher education, but on the broader society. And we're delighted to have two colleagues with us today who are really in the front lines of the fight against this pernicious activity. We're pleased to have Isaac Kamola with us, who's an associate professor at Trinity College. Isaac, as you will see, and you may already know, has published extensively in this area. And we're also pleased to welcome back a FutureU alumna, BETHANY LETIECQ, who's an associate professor and campus activist at George Mason University, where she also serves as the president of the local chapter of the American Association of University Professors. So without further ado, let's learn more about our guests, starting with Isaac.
I'm Isaac Kamola. I'm an associate professor of political science at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. And my research studies the political economy of higher education. And my first book is on the production, how universities transform to produce knowledge about the world as global. And I have a forthcoming book called Free Speech and Koch Money, the Manufacturing of College Campus War with Ralph Wilson, which I'll talk more about in my presentation.
Very good. Thank you so much. And BETHANY.
I'm BETHANY LETIECQ. I'm an associate professor at George Mason University, and I teach in a unit called Human Development and Family Science, but I'm also the president of the George Mason University chapter of the American Association of University Professors, and I serve on the Faculty Senate, and I'll focus my comments today on those roles in particular and our work to organize faculty and fight back against undue donor influence at George Mason.
Very good. And before we turn to Ruben, let me also say at the FutureU website, we have several very important documents, publications from both Isaac and from BETHANY, and we certainly encourage you. Isaac's book will be coming out in November, Free Speech and Koch Money, Manufacturing a Campus Culture War. What's up on the website is his recent Inside Higher Education article, an excellent article. Where does the bizarre hysteria about critical race theory come from? Follow the money, just outstanding. And also Beth's very, very good, detailed, painful to read article that's entitled GMU's Donor Problem and the Fight for Transparency, that was published in AAUP's Academe. So with that as background, please, Ruben.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ruben Martinez. I'm professor of sociology at Michigan State University and also the director of the Julian Zamora Research Institute. I am pleased to see Beth back again at FutureU. I think she gave a presentation here about 2 years ago, wasn't it, Beth? Something like that. So thank you for joining us, and it's good to meet Isaac for the first time. FutureU really started with a national conference that we held here at Michigan State University back, I think, in 2015, focused on neoliberalism and public higher education. These conversations all stem from that, and what we're talking about is the corporatization of higher education and the kind of influences that have been impacting public higher education. Particularly today, we're going to focus on the influences of donors. We've heard Isaac mention the Koch brothers. We know that Beth has been addressing these kinds of issues over at her university for quite some time. And we are seeing greater and greater influence as time goes by. The influence has to do not only in reshaping the process for hiring people, the process for establishing units, and so forth, but it also has, I think, a great impact on academic freedom, and the other side of that, academic repression and so forth. So we're very, very pleased to have Isaac and Beth with us today. These, as Frank has said, are the folks on the front lines, and we're looking forward to hearing them. We also stand for one thing, and that is we want to have the freedom to teach and the freedom to study, both on behalf of faculty, on behalf of teachers, and also on behalf of students. Students should be free to study the world around them. They are the ones that are going to be living into the future, and they should have the maximum access to knowledge about the world as we go forward. So I'm looking forward to hearing both Isaac and Bethany today.
Excellent. Thank you, Ruben. Why don't you introduce our other Zoom room participants today?
So with us is Zach Kaiser, who has also been a presenter at FutureU and is a supporter of our initiative. Jan Beecher has also been with us, I think, from the very beginning. She has some great insight on speaking truth to power, or selling truth to power, which is also something that's taking place. Nathan has been with us as well before. He has given some excellent presentations on neoliberalism and higher education, and looking forward to working with him in the future. And Louis Dibble, whom I'm not familiar with, but he is with us, and perhaps either Frank and you can introduce him.
Sure. Terry is a professor of English, correct, Terry? And has been with us several times before, and is a colleague of Nathan Rousseau, who also has been the principal in one of our past FutureU forums, did a great job. Nathan, I'll turn to you.
Okay, I'm associate professor of sociology at IUPUC in Columbus, Indiana.
Very good. And Terry, Louis Dibble, Terry, say a few words about yourself too.
English professor at the same place as Nathan, and Nathan and I and other people meet together occasionally, somewhat stimulated by Frank's foregrounding of neoliberalism. In fact, about every several days, I see someone slamming neoliberalism, and then, Friedman and Hayek getting poked in the eye and things like that. I never noticed that before I went to one of Frank's presentations. Anyhow.
Good. Thank you so much for being here. You know, it's interesting as you bring it up, Terry. One of those persons who's maybe one of the few hundred around the country who still reads newspapers every day. And so I was reading in the Buffalo News the other day, and in the lead article on top of the fold, the reporter actually used the term neoliberalism in terms of comparing what was happening in the mayoral race there, and basically classifying the incumbent as a neoliberal. And
was that admiring or
no,
putting him down?
Criticizing, because Buffalo is one of the poorest cities in the country, highly segregated. It's in the top 20. And the argument was the mayor has not done enough, even though the city is benefiting significantly by economic development, but not African Americans. And so he used neoliberal in that regard. And I'm sure that scrambled a lot of readers to go to their dictionary. What is it? And when you think about this, and this is introduction to Isaac in his presentation, Ruben, probably 5 years ago, got me onto a publication I didn't even know existed. It was a publication written 50 years ago in 1971 by a person by the name of Lewis Powell. I knew him. At the time, he was not a member of the Supreme Court of the United States, but he was appointed soon thereafter by President Nixon. And he wrote a 7,000-word missive to the US Chamber of Commerce. And it essentially lays the foundation for a conservative game plan that would be similar to what liberals and progressives were doing in the 1960s with respect to what led to the civil rights legislation and other things, from organizing from the left. And his argument was, we need to organize from the right. And I went back yesterday in preparation for this presentation, this forum, and reread what he wrote about higher education. And essentially he said, we cannot have an agenda, a political agenda, without, my word, attacking higher education. And faculty were primarily in his sights, and also executives and funding. And when I think about Isaac's writing, the work that Bethany has written, the work she's doing, and I read that, it It's stunning. It's chilling, because what he proposed back in 1971 has become reality. And the drumbeat, the magnitude, however you want to frame it, what metaphor you want to use, has just increased. So we appreciate the work that Isaac has done from a research perspective, particularly in terms of enlightening us, and Beth in terms of the work that she's doing as a campus activist. And with that as background, Isaac, we are very much looking forward to your presentation.
Sure.
I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Let's see. Share screen. Here we go. Share. Is that showing up?
It
Oh,
is.
Great. Thanks so much to Frank and Ruben and Bethany, and for everybody for being here. It's really great. I could talk about this topic forever, so I'll try to keep it to 15 minutes, but I have a habit of talking fast and talking with great enthusiasm, because I think this is an important issue to understand just how deep and profound the right wing, and particularly the libertarian right wing's philanthropic investments in higher education and the deep political strategy. Frank talked about the Powell memo. What we're talking about and what we're seeing is the manifestation of the Powell memo on steroids. It's been a 50-year strategy, and I think that we oftentimes naively don't give it enough credit. So what I want to do today is talk about the structure of right-wing attacks on faculty. And I argue that there's going to be a bunch of different types of attacks on faculty: criticisms of faculty over violating free speech or critical race theory. Those are the two cases that I'm going to look at today, and kind of demonstrate that these appear to be organic moral outrage of people expressing on the right that their conservative values are not being represented, that they are under attack by crazy professors, social justice warriors, that liberal professors are expressing their bias in the classroom, et cetera, or saying outrageous things about race. That this is a strategy that works by manufacturing moral outrage that appears to be organic, right? I said organized here, but it appears to be organic. But I want to demonstrate that this is actually produced within a series of intersecting organizations, and those organizations are incredibly well funded and designed to appear organic. Right? This is part of the strategy of making a bunch of different think tanks and journalistic outlets all beating to the same drum, which helps explain why something like critical race theory became this sensational phenomenon and concern in a very short period of time. So I have a book that's coming out that Frank mentioned called Free Speech and Koch Money, Manufacturing a Campus Culture War, that I co-wrote with Ralph Wilson, who is one of the foremost investigators and researchers of Koch Money in higher education, a founder of the group Unkoch My Campus. And basically what we demonstrate there is just the network degree to which the campus free speech is organized. And the so-called crisis over campus free speech is manufactured at a bunch of levels simultaneously. I'll go through that argument, but first I want to bring your attention to a talk that Charles Koch gave in 1974. Right? This talk was actually in response to the Powell memo. It was in this talk at the Institute for Humane Studies that he had created and helped to fund, or he helped to fund. And in this speech, he basically says that Powell is right in that the left has dominated the university, and therefore the right wing, and not just the right, but the corporate right, the business right, needs to go on the offense in higher education. But he also made the very provocative claim that the Powell memo was actually wrong, because Lewis Powell assumed that we lived in a capitalist society. However, we didn't live in a capitalist society because people still paid taxes, supported public education, and other kinds of public goods, right? Koch has a very radical libertarian agenda. In this talk, he talks about it himself as a radical, right? And he basically, his goal is to fundamentally transform society to one that scholars like Nancy McLean and Theda Skocpol and others have called property supremacist, right? That individual property rights determine all aspects of society, and that the government is always a threat to that. So in this particular speech in which he was saying that the Powell memo is not even the starting point, that we need to establish laissez-faire, completely unregulated capitalism, he also laid out the place in which this struggle should be fought. And he talks about political and lobbying groups, he talks about the media, he talks about the law, but he also said that higher education is a place that where you have the greatest multiplier effect. You get your biggest bang for your money in investing in higher education, because it is in higher education, and that this was a strategy that was laid out by Richard Fink. Richard Fink is a Rutgers economist who went on to positions in the Koch Foundation, and basically laid out the strategy, the underlying strategy of Koch investments and their political strategy. What Richard Fink said is that you can use a conception of production the same way that Hayek conceptualized production, and you can apply it instead of to widgets, you can apply it to social transformation. So if your outcome is to change society in a radical libertarian direction, you can think of that as your outcome. Okay, so where do you start? You start with the raw material. And he considered the academy as essential for producing raw material. The raw material is the ideas that are developed by academics about anarcho-capitalism, about the threat of regulation, the Laffer curve, all of this kind of libertarian nonsense, right? And you also create and you recruit the talent, right? You identify the young students, you train them, and you bring them into a network, what they call the talent pipeline, right? Then the ideas from think tanks or from the academy, the raw materials, moves into think tanks, in which is manufactured into public policy, refined into public policy and specific proposals. And then those specific proposals are then given to advocacy groups and outreach organizations. And that would be Americans for Prosperity, Freedom Works, these kinds of AstroTurf groups that kind of push the agenda, be it second rights amendments, stand your law ground, anti-union legislation, climate denial, anti-climate legislation, privatization of K-12, privatization of higher education, privatization of prisons, whatever the idea that was theorized by the academic, developed in the think tank, and then pushed out into these advocacy groups. And then your final objective is then the lawmakers who then pass the laws, right? So instead of the lobbyists as being, so you can see that their integrated strategy, they call it an integrated strategy for social change, starts with higher education, deeply values higher education, and seeks to not just affect policy outcomes, but to fundamentally transform how society operates by changing the ways that people think about very basic things and how action and political and social life is organized. So this is how we argue that it looks in the campus free speech movement. So you have student groups like Students for Liberty, Americans for Liberty, Young Americans for Freedom, Turning Point USA, all funded by Koch donor network and the plutocratic libertarian press, right? You have provocateurs like Milo Yiannopoulos, Charles Murray, Ben Shapiro, whose whole careers, Candace Owens, Heather McDonald, whose entire careers are funded within Koch think tanks, Koch-funded think tanks, and other organizations, media outlets. The student groups get money from the plutocratic funded student groups to bring provocateurs to campus. Media outlets that are part of this outrage machine kind of get all hysterical about these speakers being denied access or about people protesting, and then that gets transformed into groups like ALEC, Goldwater Institute, FIRE, and others, pushing legislative and legal solutions that put pressure on colleges and universities in order to make them change their free speech policies, in order to make them more susceptible to donor control, right? So free speech predicated on First Amendment, the claim is that everybody should be able to say what they want to say, right? Academic freedom and the norms that exist in higher education talk about knowledge as something that's vetted and something that's socially produced inside disciplinary constraints, right? So free speech, their argument is, if you have a scientist who says climate change is happening, here's the scientific evidence, and you have somebody who says climate change is not happening, a free speech argument would say these two need equal time, right? And basically what their arguments around free speech is to break down the barriers that reduce and constrain donor control over higher education, right? And that's the undergirding strategy of weaponization of free speech. It's the same strategy that they used in tobacco legislation and the arguments around against the illegal and political attack on tobacco. It's the same strategy they use for climate. It's the same strategy that they use for COVID denial and for voter restriction laws, right? The same kind of argument, right? One of the ways that this kind of the campus free speech works in practice is you have certain groups that are specialized. Remember, this is a conception of production, right? So there are Koch funded and Koch network funded groups that specialize in monitoring higher education and producing outrage. Groups like Campus Reform, the College Fix, Turning Points that also fund Professor Awash list. In the case of Campus Reform, they have $1.3 million a year in which to spy on professors and universities and to write outrage pieces in which they pay students between $50 and $100 per piece to monitor faculty and those correspondents are contractually obligated to identify liberal bias among the faculty and different policies that they're writing about. Because this is a networked organization and a network structure and strategy, those stories that get generated, the raw material, the outrage raw material, if you will, that gets generated by groups like Campus Reform and College Fix, quickly migrates into the Daily Caller, Breitbart, Daily Wire, Fox News, etc., which have deep connections between these kinds of outrage machines and these media organizations. The plutocratic libertarian right, like Leadership Institute, which funds Campus Reform, they specialize in training journalists, right? Young Americans for Liberty and other student groups also specialize in training journalists and place many of them in these outlets that then pick up the stories by Campus Reform. And these outlets oftentimes run stories that are basically verbatim from Campus Reform. So you can imagine being an 18-year-old in your dorm, paid $100 to write a story in an hour, and then two days later is on Tucker Carlson's show. It happens all the time. And so basically what I've done is I've written about this phenomenon, and I started a project where I monitor Campus Reform. And when a story targets a professor, I reach out to that professor with a series of resources, basically saying, here's what Campus Reform is, here's who funds them, and here's how you can respond and how your administration could respond. I can put those links in the chat during the discussion. As a result of that work, we were able to field a survey with the AAUP, with Hans Tita, with Jorg Tita at the AAUP, who is their director of research. And we found a number of very, very interesting findings in the survey of faculty who were targeted by Campus Reform in 2020. 78% of stories were in public forums. So while Campus Reform claims to be rooting out bias on campus, they're actually identifying and writing about people's Twitter feeds and social media, right? 40% of faculty received threats of violence following being written about in Campus Reform. And of the topics were covered, 42.5% dealt with race. Not only that, we found that of that 40% of faculty that received threats of violence, almost 40% said that they changed their social media presence as a result of those threats, and lesser percentages change their teaching and research agenda. But you can see this is having exactly the intended effect. You write an outrage piece about a faculty who says something about critical race theory or defund the police or about Trump, right? It goes from Campus Reform to Fox News, and all of a sudden there's this slew of harassment that beats down on those faculty, and now faculty have to consider how they present themselves in public and what they say on social media, how they teach their class. It's meant to look organic and as organic outrage, but it's instead part of this this very clearly organized and integrated strategy of social change that's having its effect. Case two is critical race theory. So where does critical race theory and this outrage of critical race theory start about? This is going to be slightly different than the piece that I found that I wrote in Inside Higher Education, because I came across some new stuff, including great reporting by Benjamin Wallace Wells in I believe it was the Atlantic, right? And he basically identifies the origin of critical race theory. Chris Root, a Seattle guy, he was working for the Discovery Institute, which is a right-wing think tank that pushes creationism as a valid thing to teach in the classroom. He got leaked some stuff about sensitivity trainings that were taking place in Seattle that were, and then he wrote an outrage piece saying, "Can you believe this? The city of Seattle is asking its employees to contemplate their whiteness. This is outrageous." And then because of that story, he got leaked a bunch of other sensitivity trainings, which he wrote up for pieces in the Manhattan Institute's City Journal, right? The Manhattan Institute between 1998 and 2019 received $15 million from the Koch Foundation. Rufo is now a fellow at the Claremont Institute, Heritage Foundation, Pacific Research Institute, and a correspondent at the Federalist Society, all organizations that are deeply integrated within the plutocratic libertarian donor network and receive considerable funding from Koch Foundation and others who attend his donor seminars, etc. In this piece, Rufo explicitly said that he picked critical race theory because it was the perfect villain, right? Unlike political correctness or wokeness, right? That critical race theory had a certain ring to it that made it a perfect villain, because everybody hates things that are critical, have to do with race, and are theoretical as opposed to practical. So having nothing to do with the content of what critical race theory is, this was selected as a political strategy, right? That got blasted all through the right-wing think tank infrastructure from the Manhattan Institute, right? Then he goes on Tucker Carlson in September 2nd, who comes across his material. The next day, he gets a call from Mark Meadows, who says Trump is really interested in this issue. This is President Trump's chief of staff at the time. And then that is what leads to the executive order to ban critical race theory and sensitivity trainings, right? In January 2021, there's a newly formed Center for Renewing America that is writing a lot of the legislation about critical race theory at the state level. That's run by Russ Voigt. Russ Voigt was the guy who wrote the executive order in the Trump White House. He's now working at a think tank and has not disclosed who his donors are. But we can have some clues about who they might be, right? And then at the same time, you have a group of grassroots organization. No Left Turn in Education may have a greater claim to being a grassroots organization, but it only exists as a viable entity because of the platforming it gets from Tucker Carlson and this massive megaphone it gets. It also has a well-documented explicit racism to it. Parents Defending Education is a Koch-funded, it's a bunch of Koch-funded veterans of Koch-funded outrage machine that are basically creating these organizations that then create the infrastructure for parents to go to city council meetings and school board meetings and raise their concern over critical race theory. Right. So again, you see how this integrated strategy feeds into each other, tries to look organic, and is well funded at every step. Right. And the strategy is to undermine and attack those who are talking about issues that undermine a plutocratic libertarian agenda and critical race theory, and the conception that society is structured by the past violences of racism and settler colonialism is an existential threat to libertarian economics that wants us to live in a fantasy land that we are all free to choose our own futures as rational individuals in a perfectly rational market, right? And so this is not only Powell memo neoliberalism, it's Powell memo neoliberalism on steroids that's been integrated and networked for 50 years, is incredibly well funded, with people moving back and forth across this network, students being on our campuses being drawn into the network, and trained to become activists and provocateurs in this particular organized, integrated, and incredibly successful political strategy. Steve Bannon has declared that critical race theory is going to be the Republicans' campaign in 2022. So.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. I mean, what you've done in your work is just spectacular, because you you take names, give locations, and fit it all together for us. And then what I was thinking, and others may think the same thing, I'm sure, you go, sure, this is coordinated. This is a networked activity. But what we read in the paper, we don't know, we don't realize how things got there. So thank you very much, Isaac, very much appreciated. Beth, I want to start by quoting something from your article in Academe that I think fits so well and links to what Isaac just presented. Quote, "The growing dependence on philanthropic giving, coupled with the shift toward donor empowerment in gifts to restrict gifts, has rendered universities vulnerable to undue outside influence. That came to a head in 2016 when the Koch Foundation and an unnamed donor gave GMU $30 million. So you've experienced significantly as a faculty member what Isaac has been talking about. So please, your thoughts about Isaac's presentation, and also share with our audience your perspective and experience.
Well, thanks. I wasn't going to present PowerPoint, but as I was listening to Isaac, I thought maybe I'll pick up where I've given this talk about undue donor influence at Mason, but maybe I'll just add a couple of slides to really show further still what Isaac was talking about how this actually works on the ground at a particular institution, at my institution. And let me just hit play here. You all can see my slides, I take it. So yeah, and I so appreciate, Isaac, your work. I was one of those faculty followed around by a reporter student from the college fix who would just shove his cell phone camera in my face during faculty senate meetings, during all kinds of just meetings. And then he would write about what I was saying, and it would show up on the college fix. And then, of course, it got picked up by broader outlets. And it is daunting when that happens. I mean, it is an effective strategy because it does create anxiety, and you do get hate mail and threats, and you have to then discern whether those threats are real or what you should do about them. It is very silencing. So let me tell you a little bit about how this, how Isaac's presentation actually lands on the ground at Mason. And George Mason is by far the biggest recipient of Koch funding, has received well over 120 million. I've lost count. It's well over 120 million dollars now from the Kochs. And what we see at Mason is that this cash buys you academic capture. And I draw that term from, and have been following Dave Rapich and some of his work on academic capture and what that means. In particular, the Kochs have captured the law school and the econ department at our institution. But in addition to capturing units, the Kochs have established with Richard Fink and others various entities on campus. They're all 501c3 nonprofits, which is important because that means they're guaranteed privacy. But yet they're affiliated with the university, which gives them a veneer of academic legitimacy. We have the Institute for Humane Studies that Charles Koch is still involved with, the Mercatus Center, which does a tremendous amount of lobbying work, and the Law and Economics Center, which is shamelessly offering these seminars to judges and attorneys general on how to make rulings in the court that are that support free market ideology, essentially. In 2016, as Frank mentioned, in 2016, the university received $30 million, 20 million from the Charles Koch, 20 million from an anonymous donor connected to Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society, and another 10 million from the Charles Koch Foundation. And with those dollars, the university agreed to rename our law school the Antonin Scalia Law School. And and here you see the Law and Economics Center when President Trump took office, just brazenly talking about how this is an opportunity to take advantage of this once in a generation opportunity to shape the contours of federal law for decades to come. Developing courses and curricula expressly designed to educate new federal judges who will be appointed in the coming year. I mean, this is coming from an academic unit with very explicit plans of how to capture the courts. So the timeline for faculty organizing along with student organizing started a long time ago in 2010, really, when Jane Mayer's book came out exposing the Koch network ties to GMU. And really it was the students and just a handful of professors who started to take note and begin to organize. And students started to FOIA the university for Koch-related gift agreements to try to understand, was there undue donor influence going on at Mason? Unfortunately, the GMU Foundation, like many university foundations, is a 501c3 entity, and they said the foundation does not adhere to Virginia FOIA laws, and so ultimately the students sued the university and the foundation to try to gain access to the records so that you could follow the money, this undue donor influence at Mason. And unfortunately, that case went all the way to the Virginia Supreme Court, which ruled that the foundation was a private entity, even though it's on our campus, even though the foundation funds 75% of the president's salary. With these Koch dollars coming through, but yet it's private and we can't see the terms of the deal. And to make a really long story short, the faculty with the student group fought really hard to expose undue donor influence and to expose the ways in which all of this is churned out by these different entities on our campus to promote anti-labor, anti-government, anti-climate science, all of these things. And while the university pushed back hard and called us conspiracy theorists, said, this is not true, ultimately, these gift agreements were revealed because of the lawsuit. And we got our smoking gun in 2018. And since then, we're able to at least begin to revise policies at the university to state that when the university accepts money from the foundation, it has to put in writing the terms and conditions of the gift agreement, such that faculty should be able to discern, to at least some extent, what these donors are getting for the giving. Unfortunately, and I'll add, the state of Virginia, we worked with legislators, and the state actually passed new FOIA laws that all state universities have to adhere to these new disclosure laws with regard to these gifts coming from the foundation to the university. However, who sits on the committees that that is monitoring all of this. And, it's perhaps one or two faculty members and the rest are foundation folk and administrators. And so it's very difficult to make sure that even these policies are being adhered to. And there's some instances at the university that, and I'm gonna push through all of this, sorry, just to make one final point, because there is some evidence at the university that, these gifts are still not being scrutinized fully, and that the administration is continuing to support the foundation and saying these gifts don't apply to the law. And one example is George Mason's University's Global Antitrust Institute. And that work has been covered in the New York Times and other press outlets. So I think I will, I'm going to pause I'm going to stop sharing this and make just a few more quick comments about, what Isaac is putting out there and where I see, where we need to go forward. And really my call to action is complex. It has to begin truly organically, not fake organic, but truly organically. Faculty have to begin to organize in earnest. Faculty, particularly faculty who have power on campus, must organize and begin to really push back against this assault on higher education and academic freedom. For too long, faculty have, whether it's with naivete or just with a disinterest, I don't know, have not really dug in. And in fact, many faculty on campus push back against faculty organizing because they think it's disruptive or that it's too conflictual and they don't want to be a part of that. However, we must get used to conflict because we're in one, right? We are in a war, not one we asked for, but clearly there is a cultural war that is upon us and we must respond. It is no longer adequate to simply, put our heads in the sand and say, well, our research is too important. We can't take time out to engage over here and support other faculty and colleagues who are fighting back. But beyond, what faculty and students can do, Brendan Cantwell had a piece out today in the Chronicle of Higher Education talking about how, presidents and administrators have got to start fighting back. And it is true, presidents need to step in and step up and start fighting. You saw what happened at UNC Chapel Hill when administrators didn't step up, and they lost big time, and so they need to step up. But as Frank mentioned to me earlier, presidents serve at the pleasure of boards, right? And so when you really want to think about where the things need to change, we need new board governance. We need new policies. At our institution, one faculty member and one staff member get to sit on the board as non-voting members. Imagine if we had a board governing the university that actually had empowered faculty and students and gave them more voice to protect academic freedom and to push back against corporate influence in higher education. So, we must, there must be a multi-layered, coalition that is built to push back against this. And unfortunately, the university for too long has thought perhaps of itself as above the fray of organizing or above the fray of getting into these, into these contests to our peril. And so, I hope that we can inspire faculty to push in, to dig in hard, Thanks, Isaac. I gotta increase my numbers. I'm in denial. But we need, so I'll end there. But I thank you again for bringing these issues to the fore and letting us speak to them, because we need to keep pushing forward. There's too much at stake to include our very democracy. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. The work that both of you are doing is so important. You used a word, transparency, which is so critical here. And when you think about the chilling effect of the recent decision, actually, by the Supreme Court of the United States with respect to what's happening in California, these big donors can continue their work and not be identified. And there's thinking about your presentation in relationship to Isaac's. Isaac begins his Inside Higher Education article with a very important sentence. And he writes, there are now numerous well-documented examples of wealthy right-wing and libertarian donors. This is the critical part for me of this sentence, using their wealth to transform higher education in their own image. And I was thinking about that the other day with respect to my days in Nathan in Sociology 101. And the concept of cultural imperialism was always used back then to talk about what nation states have done. Cultural imperialism is exactly what has been happening. The seeking of cultural transformation, and as Isaac said, higher education is viewed as a very, very critical institution. There's a cascading effect. We have to capture, using the word that Beth used, if we can capture higher education, we can start that cascading or domino effect and begin to bring about change. Otherwise, we may not be able to do. And so the amount of money that's being invested, I won't even call it an investment, that is being used is incredible. Well, Ruben and I have had numerous conversations about how, I will use the word, how frightened we are with respect to what has been happening. It's accelerating and magnifying and deepening. So let me turn to Ruben for your observations, Ruben, not only in response to Isaac and Beth's presentations, but certainly your thoughts.
Thank you, Frank. I want to start, first of all, for thanking Isaac for presenting that excellent set of ideas regarding the structure of the right-wing attack on higher education. We are, I think, the last sector in society to be targeted, perhaps for good reason. There are smart boys and girls in our institution, so perhaps it would not have gone well to have started with us, but here we are. And we are the last, both with the responsibility of saving democracy and certainly saving academic freedom. When he talks about the structure of right-wing attacks, I'm reminded of the notion of interlocking directorates, which kind of hit the scene a few decades ago, when there was a lot of discussion about whether or not there was a ruling class in this in our society and so on. Today we call it the plutocracy, and I don't think that any rational intellectual in our society can deny that one exists today. I am really pleased with how well the two presentations fit together. We hear a presentation on a framework on how the attacks are taking place, and then we hear in short a case study of how this has transpired over at George Mason University. It's just wonderful stuff, and I certainly agree with Beth that we need to organize, and perhaps faculty don't see themselves as being responsible for standing up and taking the time to organize and so forth. But if we don't, we will lose the university in terms of how we understand it, in terms of the idea of a university that is supposed to both provide guidance to larger society, but also criticism, and certainly providing the greatest opportunities for the young to learn about the world in which they live. I want to say just a few things about critical race theory, or CRT, as it has often been called, and that is that this has been an intentional attack on CRT, but as is the case usually, most of these attacks by conservatives are distortions engender what Isaac calls moral outrage. Certainly that is what is going on here. And they are masters of propaganda. They choose their concepts well. When I first heard about neoliberalism in 1984, my chair at the time was complaining about the notion of students as customers. I kept hearing the notions of choice and freedom and so forth. And, who can argue with those concepts? But what we need to understand is that they are used in a very restricted and narrow sense. And they are used to manipulate the collective attitudes in our society. We need to really focus on that. We need to also recognize that, in fact, this country is indeed founded on governance documents that privilege propertied white men. And so CRT is being attacked for saying that this country is founded on racist principles. Well, what rational intellectual would deny that, right? That's certainly the case, and the documents are there to be read, and the words run across paper and you can read them. They are there. There's no question about that. When we get back to this coordinated attack, we need to think about the fact that ALEC exists as an organization, American Legislative Exchange Council, that it develops models for conservative politicians, and that they distribute these across the country. And it is no accident that we see very similar policies being introduced in our state legislatures across the country almost simultaneously, right? I mean, like, it's impossible that all of these people could have the same ideas at the same time. This is a coordinated attack. This is how it works. When we take a look at the attack on critical race theory, it probably began, as Isaac talks about, before President Trump issued his executive order 13950. And when we look at these documents, it's kind of interesting because they're kind of a mixed thing. They have some very positive statements, in my view, like, for example, in that particular executive order, we should not promote views that one race is superior to another. Who can argue with that, right? Yes, that's what we're trying to do. That's what critical race theory says as well, right? We should not promote views that one sex is superior to another. Yet again, a very positive statement. We should not be doing that. But then there are also some statements in there that are kind of mixed in that says that we should not say that the United States is a basically racist society. Again, that is something to be debated. There are documents that show us that it is. And that then they go back to the positive. That is, every person should be respected. So we have this mix of things that if you're not a critical thinker, if you're not one paying attention to the language, you could get very mixed up with. And in fact, in many instances, it's intended to kind of engender that moral outrage that Isaac was talking about. So the order itself is not all that terrible. What is terrible is the memorandum of implementation, if you will, that was put forth by Russell Voigt, the director of the executive office of the White House, where sanctions are talked about and specific concepts and ideas are identified. So he's the one that identifies critical race theory as something that should be looked at as an indicator of possibly violating the order. Then there is the notion of intersectionality. We should not be talking about intersectionality, which is kind of interesting because back in the 90s, I was using the notion of gender as a statistical concept to make some statistical comparisons, because I was getting tired of women and Latinas not being pulled out in a combined way so that we could really understand the conditions in which Latinas were living, right? And being able to compare them to others. There are issues of systemic racism. If we talk about systemic racism, that's an indicator that we might be doing something that would be against the executive order. So there are lots of things that are both confusing and probably very, very discouraging for both those who are targeted and those who are morally outraged. It kind of gives us a mix of things. But one thing we can talk about is that these approaches tend to deny history. I mean, part of neoliberalism, the ideology of neoliberalism, has been to deny that there are social structures, that there are only individuals, that there are not any groups. So all these notions of institutional racism supposedly do not exist. And we were getting these from people who were not even intellectuals, right? People who were in government, both in England, here in the United States, telling us these kinds of things. And people, at large believe them because they're in positions of power. They're in positions of authority. So we need to recognize that all of this is distortion. We know that CRT does not do what these critics say. In fact, I don't think that they really understand what CRT is. I am a sociologist, so I view CRT as sort of old wine in new bottles, really. I mean, like if we go back to the 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on, there were a considerable number of race relations theories and other theories that are out there. But my concern is this: if they can go after CRT, which really comes out of an applied field, law, then the next step is to go for us, those of us who are students of intergroup relations and race relations in sociology and other fields, then we won't be able to study those kinds of things. So, it gives some substance to that old view that if you give them an inch, they'll take a foot. And I truly believe that this is what they would want to do. So one of the things that we need to do is to recognize that the university is under attack, that they're using CRT as a ploy, as a bogeyman, if you will, to mobilize followers to take on the university, and also to keep in mind that the academy is probably the most important institution in our society when it comes to preserving democracy and to preserving academic freedom. In fact, academic freedom is grounded on notions of freedom and democracy itself. So we need to be able to take that. We cannot reduce education to a series of career school steps in which all we're doing is providing a pipeline of students to industry. What we are about, and should be about, is to recognize that education is one of the most important socialization features, practices in our society, that is intended to develop the human faculties of as many people at the highest levels possible, so that we can move our society forward toward a higher level of civilization. And I would submit that the neoliberals have a very limited view of civilization and a very limited view of human freedom. And it is the responsibility of our generation to be able to defend and to ensure that in the academy, whether it's in K through 12 or in higher education, that we are free to teach and that we are free to study. I want to thank our speakers today for their eloquent presentations, very inspirational, and I'm looking forward to someday being able to also deliver the kinds of resources that Isaac, I think, and others have been delivering to faculty who have been attacked and who have been threatened, because really that is no way to conduct ourselves in our society at this day and age. Thank you very much.
Yeah, wonderful, Ruben. Thank you so much for sharing that. Let's open it up for discussion, questions and answers, commentary. Nathan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed listening to the presentations by Isaac and Bethany. I have to go pretty soon to attend another meeting, but I wrote down some of my own observations and reflections, and I wanted to share them before I had to go. History reflects feudalism. Liberal reform has occasionally pushed back where the lines of power are drawn. But feudalism today is alive and well. One of the biggest challenges today is that conservatives work in consort while liberals work individually, particularly among academics or intellectuals who are great at critique, but not necessarily working together. Professional associations such as the AAUP, the American Sociological Association, the American Medical Association need to show leadership by working together to form a unified political educational interest group.
Agree. Well stated. Response, please. Anyone? Terry, you're up.
Yeah, I sort of recognize Nathan's thought, because at one point I asked him, what do we do next? And it's basically organized professional organizations, which doesn't sound like a banner rallying cry, but it sure makes sense. And this might be relevant to Frank. I shared with him the name Carol Churchill, who was a anti-neoliberalism British author. I didn't identify her that way till Frank did, but there's a book that came out in 1975 written by William Gaddis, a long satirical novel called J.R. And I just had to check the date. Oh yeah, about a year after that Powell memo. And its premise is, okay, some capitalists think, let's put advertisements in textbooks. Who could object to that? And gradually everything goes down the tubes. The anti-hero of it is a disruptive young student who buys out-of-date penny stocks from a failed clothing company, not called Berkshire Hathaway, but is an evil genius. I am going to reread that. And if anyone has time to read a horrifying 500-page novel, do read Gaddis's J.R. Anyhow, that's my English professorly input onto it. And otherwise, I'm terrified by what you speakers have said. It makes me feel like I've been punched in the stomach. Thanks a bunch, guys.
Very good.
Now, if I can jump in, I did want to thank Ruben for, recentering us around the focus on critical race theory and the current attacks that are, really bolstering white supremacy, and this notion of whiteness as property is really, really important for us to hold on to. And it's just making me think too, in terms of next steps, and what's at stake here. And I just think, who are the faculty who are teaching about critical race theory, who are applying critical race theory? And so many of them are faculty of color, who, already are confronted by a system that is, heteronormative, patriarchal, and supremacist in terms of race. And so I think it's really critical that those of us who need to step up, step in front of this, particularly white academics who have been the recipients of this white advantage and privilege for a long time, and to grapple with that and to use that privilege and that power, some of it unearned, and to really confront systems and confront not just the neoliberalist pressure and the undue donor influence, but ultimately the university itself needs to be interrogated, and we need to really think about how our own systems are perpetuating so much of this. I mean, we've backed ourselves into a corner in many ways. And so while we're fighting the good fight, we also really need to think about how systems change must occur within the academy as well. There's a lot of work to do. And so, I echo Nathan's remarks of, ultimately faculty, students, professional organizations, there really does need to be this great mobilizing moment. And I'll add one more thing. At Mason, we've actually formed the GMU Coalition for Worker Rights. And this combines not just the interests of faculty and staff, but also all the contract workers who support our universities, but yet are often incredibly marginalized in terms of their pay, access to benefits, and worker rights, which of course is very Kochian in its infrastructure. But building out coalitions to include labor, to include our union brothers and sisters, even in states that are right to work, like Virginia, which we hope to change very soon. But we must think broader about the coalition building efforts that is going to take to push back against this massive, well-funded, well-coordinated and networked movement to really, destroy our institution as we know it.
Mm-hmm. Very well stated. And one of the things that I see, and I'm sure all of you do too, is that there is significant, these ideas and approaches are there's a response from the grassroots, from the general public. One of the things that I do regularly is read letters to the editor. And it's a sobering experience because many of the things we're talking about today in a sort of a lay person's way are being written about by everyday citizens in their letters to the editor, and they're applauding this work because that's what America needs to be. And so, for example, they will speak out against critical race theory, and anyone who is in support of critical race theory will be, and I've read this, will be labeled a racist. And that's, everyday people writing letters to the press. And so this is a wake-up call for all of us. And I think what you're expressing, Beth, makes a lot of sense. The coalitions are necessary. And Nathan, there needs to be organized activity by professional organizations to identify this as a very important issue. I mean, this is evolving, but it's gotten to the point now we're in a code red situation. Other comments, please.
Yeah, can I just jump in here?
Sure.
The Powell memo is really interesting, not to go back to that, because in 71, Powell explicitly says that we can use the arguments around academic freedom to drive a wedge into the left, right? Because we will say, if one part of the left will say, we can't allow this kind of stuff on campus, we have to kick Milo Yiannopoulos out, we can't hear this nonsense. And the other half will say, well, the opposite of bad speech is more good speech, right? So right from the beginning of this kind of how can corporations and the business community and the Chamber of Commerce exert greater influence over higher education to steer the types of conversations that are taking place there, back in 71, there's a clear understanding that the language of free speech, the language of academic freedom, is that important wedge issue. And I think it's also important to kind of realize that the critical race theory and the racist elements of that argument against critical race theory also goes back, right? That Powell himself was an advocate for vouchers and the privatization of K-12 education after Brown v. Board. Koch's father was one of the founders of the John Birch Society. There's this long tradition. And then to this day, groups like Turning Point USA, Young Americans for Liberty are training grounds for white supremacists on college campuses, and explicitly so, right? The white supremacists brag about how these student groups have been effective vectors into campus, right? So in a way, there's a tradition. And not only that, the language of students as consumers goes back to the Cato Institute, goes back to James Buchanan, right? Thinking about how can we make sure that 68 at Berkeley never happens again, right? Well, you have to make sure students begin to conceptualize their education as a private personal investment. And you do that through student debt, right? So in a way, we're seeing outcomes of a strategy. And so I think that Bethany's claim that we need a similar robust response, or else it's just going to be whack-a-mole, right? If the idea is, how can we make the public understand that critical race theory is not what the right says it is? You're just playing a whack-a-mole, because the next thing will be the same organization will gin up the same thing, right? And so I think that idea of a strategy of conceptualizing an alternative future that, as Ruben points out, is more emancipatory in its perspective, more humane, doesn't reduce human beings to rote economic calculators, but has a robust conception of humanity and humans' potential. That needs to be the foundation for an organized response that also understands the university's role in that as well, and defends that role, and recognize that it has to defend it without as much influence, without as much resources. And I think it's really important that this is an argument that Nancy McLean starts her book with, Democracy in Chains, right? Is that this is a stealth organization. This is dark money, right? This is, people don't like it when they hear about the truth of the amount of money that's behind here. And it only works if it appears to be organic and not plutocratic driven, right? So that argument of following the money and training ourselves whenever we see something, right? Why is the right all of a sudden talking about critical race theory? Why are they all of a sudden talking about wokeness? Why are there all of these bills around union rights? Where is all this coming from? Like, be skeptical, right? Assume that it's coming from big money and not from a disagreement among good actors engaging in rational conversation about the good of society, right? Because this is a deeply political organization. It was, it was Murray Rothbard who went to Charles Koch and said, you have to read Lenin, right? We are trying to seize the state. We are trying to seize the state in order to destroy the state, right? They understand it as a revolution. They understand it as a radical transformation of society. And if we don't defend it with the same type of understanding and an understanding of the stakes, then I think that we'll always be doomed. I'm going to throw, if you don't mind, the links to the resources I've developed around campus reform into the chat box if people are interested in kind of seeing.
Great. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes left. Ruben, I see your hand up.
Yeah.
And also Jan, did I see your hand up too? Yeah.
Well, I'll let Jan go first because I've already spoken, and if there's time left, I'll make a few comments.
All right. Well, first of all, I just want to thank everybody. There should be 1,000 people on this call, and I don't think we should settle for less than that. So I think we, just picking up on what Bethany and Isaac said. So I'll just share a couple of very random thoughts. I mean, for one thing, like what this reminded me, I don't even really play in this space formally like you do. So I'm really intimidated in some ways by all of your work. But not that long ago, there was a voice message on my work number calling for my firing because of social media posts that I apparently was making on certain websites. And of course, it was nonsense, but this call went on and on. And I contacted my son, who's a young academic, and he said, oh yeah, that's going on all over the country. They're really orchestrated efforts of intimidation that set you back. And they certainly are going to set you back if you're not protected, either by tenure and by a supportive institution. I mean, I just wrote it off. We deleted it and ignored it. But then I thought, how often is this happening? So I kind of feel just listening to you, it's like frogs boiling in a pot. I feel like I've been a frog in a pot for 35 years. And those of you at MSU know a little bit about my work. I'm sort of a participant observer in this space. I have been funded through private sources, at least in part. So I have personally felt the incentives from the university externally, and And, so I've sort of, and the chilling effect, frankly. And I just think I think it's undeniable that you navigate differently when you're dependent and your livelihood, becomes dependent. I've tried to do that ethically and responsibly, and I've pushed back on any attempts, that I have felt were inappropriate. But also in my field, and I work on providing essential services to people, utility services, infrastructure. And what I've seen, the influence I've seen here is, and that I'm trying to work on now, is sort of this sort of relentless dominance of the economics paradigm, which can be a useful set of tools. But we look at everything that way, and we forget about social justice, and we forget about public health, and we're not. And so lately I've been challenging people that instead of looking at the way we provide these services, instead of only looking at it that way, what if we shift? Let's look at it over here. And then people go, oh yeah, and so there is a maybe just a glimmer of hope there. But then just listening to you, like, it's, as Isaac just said, it's very stealth. A lot of this has been very stealth, but also I'm struck by how open it is. George Mason, I mean, that's an open secret, right? I mean, in my field, it's an open secret. We have regulatory groups that are sponsored by regulated industries, and they put their logos out there quite visibly. They're not, they don't see any conflict there. They'll have, minor rules that supposedly, create some boundaries, but so I think it's, but yet at the same time, I think you're only looking at the tip of the iceberg. I think this is much deeper and much broader and has much more an effect than we realize. I was reminded of, Koch is just the more obvious. I was reminded of, there was a good NPR story a couple of years ago. Some of you probably heard it about, I think they used the term fairness bias, or, Isaac, talked about this false equivalence and I've seen it in my field. Oh, well, if you're going to have a panel and somebody sees it this way, then you've got to have somebody who sees it that way, as if their opinions somehow are equally, grounded. And how do we address that? I'm really glad to see political science in this, because which is my training, and talking about things like capture, which I can tell you is very real. It's a theory that has come and gone, but it's regulatory capture or legislative capture now, very, very real. And that leads right to, I think, academic capture as well. I'm glad to see, more focus. There needs to be more focus on agenda setting, not just, because I do think, again, that's where there's this subtle, maybe not so subtle effect on what people study and how they study it and whether they're funded and supported to study it. There's a whole lot we don't study. I mean, and critical race, it's becoming this example of, why, we shouldn't have to fight to study something, so important. And power dynamics within the university, within institutions. I'm really glad to hear you focusing on that. So Ruben kind of alluded to a working paper I had a few years ago called Selling Truth to Power, where I tried to tackle the idea of, well, what if you do take money? What if you do take support? What are the ground rules? How do you navigate that? How do you, so at least be explicit, and at least you're thinking about it. But even though I wrote it a few years ago, I put the brakes because I thought things have even gotten so worse in the last few years. I'm not sure that I would write it the same way. And then just picking up on these last couple of themes, I absolutely think we need alliances across campuses, within campuses, with journalists, with law schools, with other institutions, with other watchdogs. It's got to be multifaceted. And also we're going to have to think hard about fighting deep pockets with other deep pockets. And I think we will need to start thinking about the implications of funding from, because this is going to come up as an issue, who's going to fund sort of the counter movement, and how do we address that? And I think, and also I think we need to think that through, and we need to think about whether this should be framed ideologically, which always makes me a little bit nervous because I think it's more even foundational than that. It's about institutions, it's about core values, and it's about the survival of, no less than democracy, no less than justice. And I think we have to be really, that we just need there's a lot of work to be done in this space. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but I think also, frankly, I think engaging and motivating with the young people who have made a mark in areas like climate change. I mean, I think that's going to be an essential part of this too. I think, that really the future will be in their hands sooner rather than later. So, but I just commend all of you for your great work in this area. I think it's just could not be more important.
Thank you, Jan. Very well stated, articulate as always. I'm looking at the watch here and we're winding down. So Ruben, why don't we turn to you for final comments and then go to Bethany and finally Isaac, and then we'll close the program.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, I just was reminded of the work by poet and musician Gil Scott-Heron, who in one of his albums talked about how the conservatives had made up look down and what was right made to look wrong. I think that's the kind of situation that we find ourselves in today. CRT is presented as a racist theory, but in fact, it is an anti-racism perspective that seeks to dismantle institutional racism. And that's something that we need to say over and over again, because as you know, if you repeat things, it kind of takes hold, particularly on the part of some people who are not well grounded in some notions of reality. We should also, I've been looking lately at some of the hearings that were conducted by the House in the 1960s regarding the New Left and so forth, and was very pleased to see that faculty organized themselves. They were not always union, they had these associations and organizations, but faculty have risen and protected themselves. They did it not only during the period of the anti-Vietnam War movement, but also during McCarthyism. And certainly, I think if we go back to the period of Nazism, we will find that faculty did in fact organize themselves. And so there's an opportunity here to recognize that this kind of massive threat does lead to people having to mobilize themselves and defend what they consider most important. And academic freedom, I think, is most important right now for those of us in the academy. And that is, it is likely to be defended by those who are conservative. It is likely to be defended by those who are liberals, and it is likely to be defended by those who are on the left. So this is an opportunity actually to work together and to ensure that academic freedom is preserved. We see today that in the broader sphere of politics, that the pendulum is starting to swing. We see what Biden is doing, the kinds of legislation that he is proposing and so forth. And so I think this is an opportunity, historical opportunity for us. And of course, this is going to ripple through for a long time, who knows how long, but it's an opportunity, I think, to right things that have gone wrong in our society. And as long as that pendulum keeps moving in that direction, we've got to get behind it and make sure that it keeps moving to the center, because the conservatives have moved the goalposts here and made the center basically some kind of conservative position, and everything on the left side of that is supposed to be some kind of communist bogeyman and socialist. But nobody talks about the liberals, but there is still a liberal center here that we need to work with, and that is going to be, I think, most important in making sure that that pendulum continues to move. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben. And also I want to say to the audience and all of those of you assembled, you may know this, but we wouldn't be here if it weren't for Ruben. He is the person who is the lead organizer, the founder of FutureU, and it's the reason why we can keep these conversations going. And it takes leadership. People have to step forward, and that's what leadership is. Talking about leadership, Bethany, your final comments.
Well, thank you again all for the great conversation, and it always inspires me to be a part of these panels and keeps me going. So I really appreciate the lift. CRT might be a provocative topic to continue to, for the neoliberal movement, this, for them to make these gains. But it's also maybe a bridge too far. I don't know. I'm hoping that faculty will say enough is enough. Okay, let's come on now. This is silly. And we really, maybe it will be the kind of motivating force that is necessary to see more folks push in and push up. And it made me think, Ruben, about not only the importance of fighting to protect academic freedom, but of course, we haven't really even scratched the surface of talking about shared governance and the real role of faculty in the academy to control curricula and that sort of thing. And this is just an opportunity for us to really come back together and reimagine these systems to be more socially and racially just. And really to push forward to demand shared governance. Of course, we have a lot of work to do, but thank you again for this opportunity.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it, Beth. Isaac, we'll give you the last word.
Yeah, thanks again to Frank and Ruben and Bethany. It's been really a pleasure to be here. And I'm really, like Bethany says, it's so optimistic to hear other people who are working in this space. And the work that you've done at GMU is just incredible. And the students and Transparency GMU movement, I think, is a real model. It's important to also give a shout out to other organizations that are doing this work in this space. Unkoch My Campus does a really good work and they have incredible resources on their website. And the AAUP is always an amazing resource. If you're not already a member, please join. And I think that too, like I got into this line of work in 2017 when campus reform attacked my colleague and accused him of stuff he didn't say. And I think that it's been a real empowering experience to basically learn and get more understanding of the institution in which I work and the industry in which I work, and to understand it. And because of taking a stake in the politics around it. And so if there's something on your campus, if there's a strange center that you don't understand, if Candace Owens or some strange speaker is brought by some random student group to your campus and that raises alarm bells, then feel free to start up a group of concerned faculty. Reach out to me, reach out to Unkoch, reach out to AAP, reach out to Bethany and say, hey, what's going on? Can you help walk me through what's going on here? Can you help me connect the dots? And I think that idea of, taking ownership over our own campuses and the governance of our own campuses. And I really go back to what Frank and Ruben said, that this is really about the future of the ability to study and the ability to teach. I mean, they understand it. The Koch plutocratic libertarian class understands it as an existential fight, right? They're in it to win it. And I think that if we desire to make sure that speech and research is not bought and sold as a commodity, if money doesn't equal speech, right? Then we have to fight to make that true. And I think Bethany said before, we're in a war not of our own choosing, and I think that's a really important. We can't just ignore this and wish it away. We have to. They've organized politically, institutionally, with considerable resources, with people who give their lives and passions and commitment, who are deeply committed to this fight. And I think that if we want to preserve a university that we desire to live and work in, that is going to require that kind of commitment. And it's good work to be a part of. So I would recommend it to anybody.
Thank you, Isaac, and thank you, Beth. Thank you, Ruben, and thanks to all of you for participating today, listening and viewing. We certainly know there are many, many options out there in terms of how you spend your time, and spending time with us. All we can say is thank you. Let me put a plug in for our next FutureU forum, and it's going to be connected to our conversation today. The title, I think, will say how. The title of the program is, What is Our Story? Where are we going? America's Struggle with Truth-Telling and Academic Freedom. And it will be held on Wednesday, July 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern. And just like today, you can participate in the Zoom room, and you can also watch live on YouTube. And we're so pleased to announce a stellar cast of guests who will be joining Ruben and me, including Mark McCormick, who's with the Kansas ACLU, Martha Burita, who is an author who just published a book in June entitled How White Supremacy Hurts All Americans, and Jacqueline McMiller, who has launched a new foundation in Fort Myers, Florida, called the Uplift, UPLIF Foundation. We're so happy to have them join us on Wednesday, July 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern, and we encourage you to join us as well. But even if you don't, we thank you for joining us today and being with us, and we hope to see you again very soon. Until then, take care, everyone.